There's a thing that happens in the afternoon, around 2 or 3 o'clock when the morning is gone and the evening hasn't started yet, and the house is very quiet. You find yourself looking at the phone, not because it rang, because you're wondering if it will, and then an hour passes, and it doesn't, and you go back to whatever you were doing, or trying to do, and you carry that small, quiet disappointment like a stone in your pocket, too light to mention, too heavy to ignore. If you know that feeling, if that afternoon is familiar to you, then you are not weak, and you are not forgotten, even when it feels exactly like that. I spent years in that afternoon, years waiting, and I want to tell you what finally changed, not what fixed it, not a trick or a technique, just what I finally understood about the waiting, about myself, about what a life can still be at 81 years old. Stay with me. I retired at 67, that was the plan. Work until 67, hand things off cleanly, and begin what I had spent 40 years calling the rest of my life. I had a rough idea of what that would look like. Travel, maybe. Projects around the house I'd been deferring. Time, finally, actually, genuinely for myself. What I didn't plan for was the silence. Not the silence of a quiet afternoon, which I had always liked, but a different kind. A structural silence. The kind that comes when the thing that organized your days, the reason to be somewhere at a certain time, the people who needed something from you, the purpose that got you out of bed, when that thing simply stops. The first week of retirement felt like a vacation. The second week felt slightly less like one. By the third week I was calling my son on a Tuesday morning just to have someone to talk to. He was at work. He called back that evening. We talked for 11 minutes. I know it was 11 minutes because I noticed. I want to describe what waiting actually felt like, because I think it's important to be specific about it. It wasn't dramatic, it wasn't despair, it was subtler than that, and in some ways harder to name precisely because of how subtle it was. It was a kind of orientation. The way a sunflower turns toward the light, I had turned toward the phone, toward the possibility of it ringing, toward the idea that at any moment someone who mattered to me might reach out and by reaching make the day feel real. When the call came, I felt better, measurably better, a kind of warmth that lasted for hours. When it didn't come, the day felt thinner, like paper instead of cloth. I structured my mornings around the possibility of afternoon calls. I kept the television lower than I needed to so I wouldn't miss the ring. I checked the phone after coming back from walks, even short ones, 20 minutes, as though something critical might have happened in my absence. This went on for years. I didn't think of it as a problem. I thought of it as love. My children are good people. I want to say that plainly and mean it, because this story could easily be read as a complaint about them. It isn't. My son works hard. He has his own pressures, a demanding job, a mortgage, children who need things, a life that runs at a speed I can barely track from the outside. He calls when he can, he visits when he can arrange it. My other son lives farther away. We talk less. That's geography and circumstance, not malice. They love me. I know this not because they tell me constantly, they don't, but because of 1,000 small things accumulated over decades that only a father would notice and catalog. But they are not available the way I needed them to be, and for a long time I made that their problem. Not openly, not with accusations or ultimatums, but in the particular way that men of my generation tend to make things other people's problems. Quietly, through a certain coolness, a pointed comment here, a weighted silence there. I was waiting for them to notice how alone I was, and I was managing my disappointment when they didn't. Neither of those things was fair to them. There's something nobody prepares you for about getting old. The list gets shorter. I don't mean the Christmas card list, though that too. I mean the list of people in the world who know your whole story, who were there, who remember the same things you remember because they lived through them alongside you. My closest friend from my working years passed away when I was 74. We had been friends for 31 years. He was the person I called when something happened, good or bad, before I called anyone else. After he was gone, there was a gap that had a specific shape. the shape of him, and nothing else fit into that shape. Another man I'd known since my 30s had a stroke that left him unable to have the kind of conversations we used to have. We still talked, but it was different, careful in a way it had never been before. Others had simply drifted, moved closer to their own children, changed rhythms, receded the way people do when the shared context that held you together gradually dissolves. By my late 70s, the circle was smaller than I had imagined it would be. And the phone, my sons, occasionally my grandchildren, had become the primary thread connecting me to the feeling that I still belonged to something. That is too much weight for any thread to hold. The moment I remember most clearly was not dramatic. It was a Thursday in November, gray day. I had driven to the hardware store to pick up something I didn't really need, a specific type of screw that I could have improvised around, and on the way home I pulled into the parking lot of a grocery store and just sat there. I wasn't tired, I wasn't unwell. I just didn't particularly want to go home yet, and sitting there in that car, engine off, I had a thought that surprised me with its clarity. I am lonely, not in a crisis way, not in a way that required emergency action, just factually, plainly, undeniably lonely. I had been circling that word for years without landing on it. I had called it other things, quieter things, restlessness, missing people, adjustment to retirement, but sitting in that parking lot on a gray Thursday, I finally let myself use the actual word, lonely, and something shifted when I did, not fixed, but shifted. The way naming a thing correctly for the first time changes your relationship to it. I drove home from that parking lot and I sat at the kitchen table for a while, and I thought about the waiting, how much of my day was organized around it, how much of my emotional life had been structured by whether or not a call came, how I had outsourced the quality of my days to a device on the side table, and the schedules of people who were living their own full lives 3 states away, and I asked myself a question I hadn't asked before. What would it look like if I stopped waiting, not stopped hoping, not stopped loving my sons or wanting to hear from them, just stopped organizing my interior life around the possibility of the phone? What would I do differently in a day if I assumed from the start that no call was coming, and that the day still needed to be lived fully regardless? It sounds simple, it wasn't, because the waiting had become a kind of companion, an orientation, something that gave the hours a shape, even if that shape was made of absence. Giving it up meant giving up a certain kind of hope, and I wasn't sure what I would put in its place. I want to tell you what I actually did, not as a prescription, just as what happened. The first thing I did was call someone, not my sons, someone from a different part of my life, a man I had worked alongside for 8 years and then lost touch with when we both changed jobs. I had his number somewhere. I found it. I called him on a Friday morning with no particular agenda. He answered. He was surprised. We talked for 40 minutes, not about anything important in the grand scheme, old colleagues, what had become of this project or that one, his knee surgery, my retirement, the way cities change. When I hung up, I felt something I recognized from a long time ago, the feeling of having been genuinely talked to, by someone who knew me from a context other than being a father or a grandfather, someone who remembered me as a man doing work in the world. That feeling was different from the feeling of talking to my sons. Both are real, both matter. But I had not felt that specific thing in a very long time. I made 2 more calls that month, both to men I had known at different points in my life, and drifted from not through conflict but through the ordinary tidal pull of time and circumstance. One of them I had assumed was probably gone. He was my age and his health had not been good the last I knew. He answered on the second ring. He was fine, a little slower, still himself. We talked for over an hour. I realized, after that call, that I had been holding a small private grief about him for years without knowing it. The assumption of absence had become real absence in my mind, and I had been mourning someone who was still there, still reachable, still glad to hear from me. How many people was I doing that with? How many connections had I written off, gently, passively, without any decision being made, simply because I had stopped reaching and they had stopped reaching and neither of us had been the one to break the silence. The second thing I did was harder to explain because it wasn't a single action. It was more of a shift in how I moved through ordinary days. I started going places not to accomplish something specific, but to be around people. The library on Tuesday mornings, a diner near my house for coffee 2 or 3 times a week, a hardware store I didn't need anything from, where the man behind the counter had been there for 20 years and always had something to say about whatever you brought to the register. None of these were deep connections. Nobody was becoming a close friend in the span of a Tuesday morning at the library, but something about being physically present among other human beings, hearing voices, catching fragments of other lives, existing in a shared space, did something for me that I hadn't expected. It reduced the pressure on the phone, not because the phone mattered less, but because the phone was no longer the only source. There were now other streams, small ones, feeding the same reservoir, and a reservoir fed by many small streams is more reliable than one fed by a single large one that may or may not flow on any given day. The third thing I did was find something to make. I had always been handy. Earlier in my life I had done a fair amount of woodworking, nothing fancy, just practical things. Shelves, small furniture, repairs. Things that required attention and produced something you could hold. I had stopped when work and family and the general velocity of middle life had crowded it out. That was 20-some years earlier. I set up a small workspace in the garage, nothing elaborate. A workbench I already had, some tools I dug out of storage, a few new ones. I started with something simple. A small step stool that my younger son had mentioned needing for his kitchen. It took me 3 weekends. It was not a masterpiece. The proportions were slightly off in one dimension and I knew it. I shipped it to him. He called when it arrived. He said, "Dad, this is really solid. I didn't know you still did this." 11 words. But they were 11 words that came from something I had made with my hands on my own time, for no reason except that I wanted to give him something real. That call felt different from the calls I had waited for, because I hadn't waited for it. I had made something, and the call had come as a result. That distinction turned out to matter more than I expected. Around this same time, I started doing something that I had resisted for years because it felt to me like admitting something I wasn't ready to admit. I started volunteering, a few hours a week at a program that worked with younger men, late teens, early 20s, who were navigating things that required the kind of perspective that only comes from having lived through several decades of decisions and their consequences. I want to be honest about my first reaction to this. I thought it was for people who had nothing else. I thought it was a kind of organized charity for the lonely. I was wrong about that. What it actually was a room full of people who needed something I had and didn't know how to get from their own lives. And what they needed was not money or connections or advice exactly. What they needed was someone who had been through enough to sit with difficulty without panicking. I had that. I hadn't thought of it as a resource. The first session I sat in on, a young man described a situation at work, a conflict with someone above him, a feeling of being treated unfairly, not knowing whether to push back or absorb it. I had lived that situation. I had made the wrong choice about it when I was his age and learned from the consequences. I had made a better choice about it 20 years later. I told him both things, without performing wisdom. Just, here is what I did, here is what happened, here is what I think I understand now, that I didn't then. He listened in a way that people listen when something is actually useful to them. I drove home from that session feeling something I had not felt in a long time. Necessary. I want to be careful here not to make this sound cleaner than it was, because it was not clean. There were still days when I went to the library and felt invisible, when the diner felt like a performance of being okay rather than actually being okay. When I picked up my phone and looked at it and put it back down and felt the full weight of the afternoon, the waiting didn't disappear, it receded. And receding is not the same as disappearing. I want to be honest about that. There were still nights when the house felt very large and very quiet, and I thought about the people who used to fill it. My wife, in the years before her illness made things harder. My sons when they were young and noisy and underfoot in ways I had sometimes found exhausting and now found, in memory, like one of the finest things that had ever happened to me. That grief is real. I'm not going to wrap it in a resolution it doesn't deserve. But grief and waiting are different things. Grief is honest. Grief is the appropriate response to real loss. Grief moves, slowly the way rivers move. It has direction even when it seems still. Waiting is something else. Waiting is grief that has attached itself to a specific hope and refused to move until that hope is satisfied. And when the hope is uncertain, when the call may or may not come, when the visit is always almost planned, the waiting can go on indefinitely, can become the organizing principle of a life. I did not want the waiting to be the organizing principle of my life. Here is what I came to believe, slowly over the years since that Thursday in the parking lot. The phone is not the relationship. My sons are not their phone calls. My relationship with them is not the sum of the minutes we have spent connected by a wire or a signal. It is 50-some years of accumulated moments. It is the texture of how I spoke to them when they were afraid. It is the arguments we had and worked through. It is the look on my older son's face when he held his first child and turned to me and didn't say anything because there was nothing to say. It is the step stool in his kitchen that is slightly off in one dimension and holds perfectly well regardless. The phone call is a small visible part of a large invisible thing, and when I started seeing it that way, when I stopped treating the call as the relationship itself and started treating it as one thread in something much larger, the phone became less terrifying to look at on a quiet afternoon. My older son did something last year that I did not expect. He wrote me a letter, not an email, not a text, a handwritten letter on paper, in an envelope, with a stamp, something I hadn't received from him in perhaps 30 years. It wasn't long, 3 pages. He wrote about a memory from when he was 11 years old, something I had completely forgotten, a particular afternoon when something had gone wrong and I had handled it in a way that had apparently stayed with him for 40 years. He had never told me. He said he wasn't sure why he was telling me now except that he had been thinking about it and thought I should know. He wrote, "I think I understood more about how to be a man from watching you handle that afternoon than from anything you ever said directly. I just never told you." I read that letter 4 times the day it arrived. Then I put it in the drawer of the side table, next to the phone, and I understood something with a clarity I had not had before. He had been watching all along. Not just watching, learning, carrying, building himself out of what he saw. The relationship had been working the whole time I was worried it was broken. I just couldn't see it from inside the waiting. If I could go back, and I can't, none of us can, that's the agreement we make by living. But if I could go back to the version of myself sitting in that parking lot on the gray Thursday in November, I would tell him this: stop waiting for the phone, not because they won't call, but because the life you're waiting to feel is already here, in the hardware store, in the garage, in the chair across from a young man who needs to hear what you know, in the phone you pick up and dial yourself. The life doesn't come through the phone. The phone is just how some of it sounds. I am 81 years old. I still look at the phone sometimes, but it is different now. It is curiosity rather than hunger, a pleasant wondering rather than an anxious vigil. My sons call when they call. I call when I think of something they'd want to know, or just when I want to hear their voices and don't feel like waiting to see if they think of it first. My circle is smaller than it was. That is simply true, and I have made a kind of peace with it. But the circle I have, the men I call on Friday mornings, the Tuesday mornings at the library, the garage where something is usually in progress, the room where I sit across from younger men and offer what I know, that circle is real. It is mine. I built it mostly in my late 70s, after a lifetime of assuming that connection would simply come to me if I deserved it. It doesn't work that way. It never did. You have to go toward it, imperfectly, awkwardly sometimes. with no certainty that the phone will be answered or the conversation will land or the thing you make will turn out the way you planned, you go anyway. That is the only thing I know for certain, after 81 years of getting it wrong more often than I'd like to admit. You go anyway. If something in this reached you today, if you recognized that afternoon, that parking lot, that particular wait, I'm glad you stayed. Leave a comment. Tell me what the waiting looks like for you. Tell me what you found on the other side of it, if you found anything. These conversations matter, more than the ones that happen by accident. If this channel feels like a place worth coming back to, please subscribe. We're here every week, talking about the things that actually happen in the quiet years, not the version people perform, but the real one. Thank you for your time. It is not a small thing to give,